All right, well, I guess let's get started. Welcome back, everybody, to our second panel on running field experiments around the world. I'm super glad to have that everyone could make it despite the schedule change. So yesterday's panel focused more on lab experiments, and I thought it'd be a good idea to discuss field experiments today and think a bit more about the nuts and bolts of running field experiments and how that might differ across the world. And from my experience, some of these cultural nuances and legal considerations and a number of other things might affect how you run experiments in different contexts. So our panelists today have worked across many different countries and contexts, but currently much of their work is focused in Europe, Latin America, and Africa. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our three wonderful speakers for today's panel. First, we have with us Catia Batista, who's an associate professor of economics at the Nova School of Business and Economics in Lisbon, as well as founder and scientific director of the Novafrica Research Center. Next, we have Kyle Holloway, who's the country director for Colombia and Dominican Republic, the country director at IPA. He's previously been a senior program manager at IPA's Financial Inclusion Program, the Gates Foundation, and has also worked at IPA Uganda. And then our last panelist is Luigi Butera. Luigi is an assistant professor at the Department of Economics at Copenhagen Business School, and he also recently founded and is the director of the Institute for Behavioral Economics. So with that, I'll give each speaker a couple of minutes to describe their background and experience working with research partners. After that, I've prepared some questions, and basically what we'll do is we'll go around, I'll ask the question, you guys can each have time to answer it, and then feel free to talk amongst each other. And if anybody has questions from the crowd, we're happy to take those during, and then we'll have dedicated time at the end to take crowd questions as well. Just a little bit of, just a notice, we'll have to end right on time because the next keynote speaker will start directly after. So with that, let's get started, and hopefully we have a great discussion. I guess if Catia, you
I start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I'll tell you guys when I ask the question. I'll call somebody out to start.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, for the kind introduction. And also thank you, Jared and Julia, for organizing this very interesting session. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today to discuss together with Kyle and Luigi. So, I mean, to tell you very briefly a bit about my research and what I've been doing. Well, I worked mostly on international migration, a lot on financial inclusion and private sector development. So these are the broad areas. And most of my work has been based on field experiments, and also, I mean, more and more recently, more lab in the field experiments. So lots of field work, working together with, for example, in the case of international migration, I've worked a lot in Africa. So I've worked, so for example, in Mozambique, in Cape Verde, and most recently in the Gambia on, I mean, topics related to irregular migration. Here, I've worked a lot with either potential migrants or families that are connected with international migrants. So that's one of the focus that, or one of the type of work that I've been doing, but also I've worked in Europe with migrants themselves. So I've worked a bit on both sides of the international migration corridors. So in Europe with immigrants, and in Africa with I mean, the families or the proper potential migrants. And in this area, I've worked on things related, I mean, such as informational intervention. So recently, so in this work in the Gambia, which is the country in West Africa with the highest rates of irregular migration to Europe, we have worked on not only providing information about the risks, for example, but also on alternative policies that could provide alternatives to these people that face, I mean, really high risks of dying on the way to Europe. And so we have worked with, say, vocational training and providing cash transfers to people to, I mean, for example, to promote regional migration. So these are the kind of field experiments that we have been doing. Although at the same time, we have been doing lab experiments also to try and measure what kind of factors influence these migration decisions, for example. Okay, so this is one of my strands of research. So I've been working a lot on this, and also on, I mean, together with Julia in Portugal, we have been working also on how to best integrate. And here again, I mean, we do a variety of interventions that we evaluate experimentally on, say, strategies to try and promote integration, be it through information, be it through non-cognitive interventions. Okay, so that's like on the migration side. Then on financial inclusion, and Kyle kind of knows this work that we have been doing for many years, especially in Mozambique. There we have worked as, we had this very strong partnership with the first mobile money provider in Mozambique. So we worked side by side with this company, and we followed the impact that mobile money was having in the country in different areas. So we worked in rural areas where for the first time we were introducing a formal financial service. These are, very poor areas in the country that really had no access whatsoever to formal financial services. But then we also worked with entrepreneurs in urban areas. We also worked with farmers trying to promote savings and investment in agriculture modernization. So, different kind of topics. So also together with Julie, we also worked with micro entrepreneurs in Mozambique, trying to see what kind of strategies were best to promote business development. And again, we tried different strategies, some more related to non-cognitive aspects, some more related to, stuff like training, okay, and combining them and seeing how they interact. So I think, I don't think I have much more time. So, very briefly, I would say this is the kind of experiments that I've been doing. With more that we can discuss as you ask the questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Catia. I guess, Luigi, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Again, first of all, thanks, Jared, Julia, and everyone for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful conference. So I'm Luigi. I'm an assistant professor here at Copenhagen Business School. I would say the bulk of my research revolves around understanding how non-financial incentives affect socially desirable behavior. So most of my work concerns social preferences. I touch upon different sort of domains in which these preferences might be relevant, from charitable giving, public goods contributions, health decisions, and more recently, I've been starting working on financial decisions and sort of trying to combine experiments with administrative data, which is really amazing here in Denmark. I think two themes of my research is one, sort of trying to develop tools that allow us to quantify the value that people place on intangible goods, things that don't have a market value. For instance, you can imagine a public recognition or social image. And two, sort of try to think about how we can sort of improve the reliability of our research. So on the one hand, thinking about things like scaling, so something that John will talk about in the next panel session, to how we can improve sort of the reliability of our estimates through replications. More on the sort of organizational side, sort of a field experiment side. So during my time in Chicago, I co-organized with John and others, Anya and Mike, the Summer Institute for Field Experiments. It was a brainchild of John, sort of a 3-year program where every summer we would invite young scholars that are interested in doing field experiments and firms interested in sort of partnering with academics. As Jared mentioned, sort of we recently received, John and I, some funding to start sort of a more permanent version of that pilot program here in Europe. And hopefully there will be time to sort of discuss a little bit sort of what have we learned from that first experience at Chicago and what we're trying to do now to scale and do things a little bit better.
My turn. So thanks everyone for the invitation as well. So I am the non-academic invitee to the panel. So I have the great privilege of working with a lot of academics, but I'm not one myself. So I'm Kyle Holloway. I am the country director for Innovations for Poverty Action office here in Colombia, and I've worked with IPA for a variety of years now, almost 10. First starting in Uganda, and then later working with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on a project in relation to financial inclusion, and then now here in Colombia. And so for those of you who may not know IPA's work, we work primarily at the nexus between researchers and implementers or policymakers, helping both parties be able to identify particular questions of interest, design experiments to be able to answer those questions, implement those experiments in the field, and then produce results, share those, and then hopefully lead those towards policy decisions. And in terms of sectors, I've worked across a lot of different sectors. IPA is sector agnostic, so everything from early childhood development and education to migration issues to crime and violence and a bunch of others. So yeah, I'm excited to share a little bit more kind of from the perspective during today's panel on actually identifying some of those particular questions of interest and implementing those in the field as someone who's not an academic myself, but works a lot with academics like Catia and Luigi.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody. So it seems, I mean, we have, more sort of in the field working with actual people in Africa versus working with administrative data and firms in Europe and well as in Latin America. So you guys all have like this sort of different approaches to doing field experiments. And so I guess the first question would be sort of for graduate students or say young scholars, assistant professors early in their careers, how would you get started doing field experiments or experimental economics in general? And do you think it's a good idea to do them in your primary region of study, or sort of what's exciting about these regions in your opinion?
Should I go first again?
Oh yeah, sure. Let's start with Catia, and then
share.
the next one I'll call out Kyle or Luigi.
Okay, so, well, my opinion, teamwork is the essence of doing experiments and field experiments. I think, it's the kind of work that it's impossible to do without collaboration. And I think if you are, early in your career as a researcher, that's particularly important. I think there are many things that we keep learning, even after we are doing experiments for some years. We keep learning as we do experiments. So I think this idea of having a diverse team is really important. This is, so in terms of experience doing experiments, but also in terms of diversity of people in your team. Okay, so we all come with different sets of expertise, but for example, when you are working in regions of the world that you are not too experienced with, it's very important to have someone in your team that really knows the ground. I know that IPA, for example, through their offices, has this expertise kind of inbuilt, but when you are working in different ways, so at Novafrica, we also have offices mostly in the Portuguese-speaking African countries, but we have this kind of expertise inbuilt, but it's helpful that someone in the research team has this kind of expertise, I think. That's my experience, and that's the way I learn the most when I join new teams with people that have done different kinds of work. Now, with this said, doing field experiments is always a big investment. For sure, this is not the most, how can I say, the most efficient route to get to the top publication, because you can do that without fieldwork for sure in a much easier way. So this is something that I think we all love to do. I think the beauty and what makes me really enjoy doing these experiments and keep doing them, even when it's such a lot of work, and even when, so many experiments fail so often, is the fact that we like to be in touch with people, to learn from them, and to really understand what are the problems. Of course, we always want to start with some theoretical framework, your hypothesis well set and supported in theory, but then when you get it to the field, that's when you really learn. Okay, and so, so what can I say to the young scholars? That was the question you asked me. Okay, so it's, the teamwork, I think, is the essence, having diversity in your team. And then, okay, I have here a comment. Okay, I won't take these long answering all questions, but I would like to make it, because I think I'm kind of the gender representative in the panel. And there is something related to young researchers that I wanted to talk about, which is not only for females, I think it's for all young male and female researchers that want to start and also want to do field work. And I think this is really important, because this is a common, I would say, a common concern when you are about to start your research career and you want to have tenure, of course, and you also want to have your family. And I think field experiments are especially challenging and demanding on young scholars that want to achieve both goals. And so, for me personally, so I have 3 kids. My first daughter, she was born when I was still a PhD student at the University of Chicago. So yeah, I've been through this. I started doing experiments when I already had one kid. And I think this is always a balance that we have to keep striving for. And of course, I mean, doing experiments always requires that young scholars make some kind of investment and sacrifice. But this is something I think that we should solve. I don't have a perfect solution or recipe for this, but I think it's important that we are all aware of these, that we talk about it, because that can make us as a community more supportive of these of the needs that people have, that researchers have in the field. I mean, I personally, so I've taken, so this girl that was born when I was still doing my PhD, 6 months after she was in the field in Cape Verde, then I try to travel with my kids as often as I can, but oftentimes this is just not possible, obviously. I mean, the kind of work that we are doing often does not allow for this to be possible, and we have to make choices. We have to, be apart from the families, and juggle a bit things at home. And I think, okay, I hear, okay, so many young researchers, particularly recent mothers, hesitating on whether they should keep attending conferences, stop doing experiments. I mean, no, we should keep trying to do this, but it's really a challenge that we should all be aware of, so that we can, again, as a community, be more supportive, so that, these young experimental researchers can get tenure and can have a life, not put it on hold until they're 40. Okay, so that was my final thing to say, that I think it's really important, because, again, doing experiments is challenging. I think we all do it because we learn a lot from it, a lot more than just from sitting at your desk, maybe. But there are lots of balances that have to be kept in mind. So I'll shut up for now.
Thanks, Catia. I guess Kyle, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, Catia brought up tons of good points. I think, and kind of bringing the last point, which is incredibly important, back to our first on teamwork. There's this balance between, wanting to be there yourself and kind of do and be engaged in every aspect, from the relationship with a potential partner to, the hiring and training of a field team, to the qualitative work. There's that side of it. And then there's the other, that sometimes you have to rely on your team members to be able to play that part when you're not able to. And that's a constant trade-off. I see, especially for junior researchers versus more senior researchers. Junior researchers want to be there in every aspect of the fieldwork, and that's important. And that's usually valued a lot from our teams and team members. But at the same time, there are those trade-offs that Catia was bringing up. So I think trying, as a junior researcher, to find that right balance of where can you invest your time, and you really need to be there, and which things can you communicate through the teams and the relationships that you've built, and do so in an efficient remote fashion. I think especially, through the past year, we've learned to work out of necessity through more remote means. And so, finding ways to do that effectively, I think, is important. I do think that patience is incredibly important in field work, and that can be very hard for more junior level researchers, because they want to move things along quickly. They want to be able to publish quickly, and there's a lot of flexibility that's needed, because things are changing constantly with partners and with things that are happening in the field. And so being able to always take in the new information and adjust accordingly, and choose which things to hold kind of firm to, and which things you can be flexible on, and kind of keep moving things forward, is usually a quality for a junior level researcher wanting to do field experiments, that I think those that are able to be more patient, to be flexible around the right things, usually have more enjoyable experiences and maybe more success than those that struggle with some of those aspects. And then one other aspect that I usually find is very helpful for junior level researchers wanting to get into field experiments, and I'd be curious to know, going back to Catia's point, how to do this, is investing in some qualitative work around ideas, and being able to actually, before kind of formulating a solid idea that you're inflexible on, spending some time understanding the underlying assumptions of whether that's the intervention or the way in which you're going to do measurement, and not coming to a situation with the idea kind of fully formed and hoping that it just works out and kind of driving forward versus, spending some time in that qualitative kind of period of time. Of course, that takes usually extra time. You have to invest that. Maybe you need to be physically present for a lot of that to gather that. And so that can be hard. Again, maybe going back to the teamwork to do that. But I usually find that junior level researchers who are coming to the table with an idea, but some willingness to be flexible and kind of understand how they might adapt the design before driving forward is usually helpful.
My turn?
Yeah, go ahead.
So first of all, I just want to essentially repeat, I think 3 points that were touched upon in yesterday's panel for lab experiments by Lise Vestel, Gary Charnas, and Ricardo Perez, which I think are absolutely fundamental for field experiments as well. One is, as Gary mentioned, do stuff you like. As as Kyle and Catia mentioned, this is very time-consuming work, so you might as well do something that you're really passionate about. Two, as Lise pointed out, you are primarily an like an economist. They use experimental methods. You're not an experimentalist, and I remember in my junior years, like the temptations, like immediately going through. That's kind of echoes what Kyle just said, like walking through the partnerships with the idea of like, I have a design. I have an idea of what I want to do. Try to keep your perspective open and think like an economist before thinking as an experimentalist. And three, as Ricardo said, and kind of echoes what Cal and Catia just said, ask a lot of questions, keep an open mind. Usually, especially, and this is true when you work with firms, I like to think that there's sort of two sets. One is the set of things that business cares about, and another is the set of what academics care about. And your job is to find the intersection between these two. Because if you push for stuff that the firm doesn't care about, you're never going to run an experiment. If you go too much in the way towards the firm, you're going to run experiments no one will publish. So second, I just want to bring you some data from, since we had this 3 years experience of the Summer Institute, I would just want to tell you some numbers and sort of my takeaway from those numbers. So first of all, we had more than 60 partnerships during these 3 years, and about 23% resulted in a paper. So the first message is a little bit negative in the sense that it is hard to move a partnership from the first chat where everyone is enthusiastic to a final accomplished paper. So about 1 in 5, 1 in 4 ended up in a paper, and we had a handful that even went to top 5 journals. So there was hope, but this is a steep road. Now, why do partnerships fail? We surveyed our participants during the 3 years, and they're sort of, I think the main message is like for marriages, when they fall apart, it's never the fault of only one person. There's always like a mixed responsibility. So about 80% of the scholars report that the partnership failed because the firm partner, the organization partner, lost interest. I think to address minimize the risks related to what firms do is to really early on in partnerships, trying to understand what I call the 3 environments. Environment number 1, trying to understand what is the incentives environment of the firm. When you usually start talking to a firm or an organization, it's because there's one guy that is really interested in working with you. Now, I encourage every young scholar to see firms the same way public choice scholars look at the government. So every person is an individual actor that is maximizing something. So the earlier you find out why is your champion within the organization want to work with you, the better position you will be to maximize the benefits from this partnership. Incentives not only of the champion within the company, so why is this person working with you? What is his disposition? What is he trying to get out of that? And sometimes, you end up, discussing with someone who maybe was had ambitions to be a scholar in his previous life, and he just loves to stick around with economists. And that's usually not a very good premise, because there's going to be a little commitment from that person to really move from initial ideas to an actual paper. Of course, incentives of the company as well. ask a lot of questions. What are the goals? What are the long-term goals, short-term goals of the organization? Are there deadlines they're facing? Are there budgetary constraints? Everything that can help you understand where the firm or the organization is going, it will help you understand what is the incentive environment. Environment number two, I think it's what I call the institutional environment. And this is what has to do with hierarchies, red tape, and decisions. Some organizations are really flat, meaning that it doesn't really matter whether you're talking to the CEO or the guy on the field. Decisions are taken horizontally. Some organizations are more hierarchical. It's really important to understand, I think, the risk posture of the organization. Some organizations are extremely risk averse, and usually you find out when it's too late. Let me give you a simple example. You spend months talking to people who are the ones who are actually going to work with you on the experiment, only to realize that top management is extremely risk averse to experiments. It's extremely risk averse in terms of trying new stuff. So this is stuff you want to find out early on. And three, and I think perhaps the most important, in understanding the data environment. Many times we walk into partnerships and we think, oh, wow, these guys have amazing data. They must have a ton of information. This is fantastic. Half of the time, if not more, data is really hard to get. First, sometimes it's legally impossible to get that data, especially if you work in Europe. Privacy laws are really tough and make it really, really difficult to work with companies' data and organizations' data. Two, data may exist, but may be scattered around different data sets that don't talk to each other, may be handled by different people, maybe are very jealous of their data. And as a consequence, like things you would expect you could put together into a data set, it turns out is really difficult. So I think these are the three sort of environments that you would really need to understand really early on. Now, as I said, partnerships fail also because of scholars, and our scholars at SCIFE reported that about 43% of them reported that the partnerships failed because of themselves. And I think in that sense, I just want to repeat what Catia said and Kyle, it's fundamental to have a team. Just because you know how to run experiments and just because you know how to put up a good design and perhaps have a nice theory, it does not mean you know how to conduct field experiments. So I think humbleness is key here, meaning that in my experience, every experiment that's ever worked has 4 key figures that might be 4 people or 1 person with these 4 skills. One is someone who's really good at theory, and theory is fundamental because it helps you understand what are the parameters that are absolutely necessary for you to pull out a decent study. And so having a good understanding of the theory you want to test tells you something about when it's useful to pull the plug from a partnership, and perhaps because those parameters cannot be obtained. 2, someone who's good with that design and empirics. That goes without saying. If you do experiments, you want that. Someone who has experience not only with data, but that specific type of data. Don't underestimate how different data sets can be incredibly challenging. Like if you're working with data from a supermarket, grocery store, think about including someone who's really like a marketing economist, someone who knows how to handle those massive data sets. And last but not least, you need to have someone on board who's good at managerial skills. Like there's the science part of running experiments, but there's also field experiments. There's also a part that has to do with managing human relations and keep pushing and knowing how to talk to people who are not economists. Yeah.
All right, great. Thanks everybody for those responses. I mean, you guys have mentioned so much, and I wish we had like 3 hours to talk about all these things because I have so many follow-up questions from what you've already said. But I think we alluded to a lot, Catia, you alluded, and Kyle as well, to all these trade-offs, and Luigi about potential things that you could notice to help you move projects along. And that kind of leads into the next question. And some of you guys have touched on this already, but sort of like, what do you think are these essential characteristics of partners or field experiments that must be met when pursuing a project? And Luigi, I know you kind of touched on this already. Or alternatively, like really, what are some of the early signals that you would suggest that you should not move forward with the partner or the experiment? And I guess, well, I would also want to think about, if you don't move forward, sort of like how you approach that, or how you approach that with the firm. Kyle.
All right. Now, Luigi mentioned a bunch of these things, already, and I thought that it was an excellent summary. It's tough, I think, because oftentimes, for the most part, I think people go into situations. Some people are overly skeptical, some people are overly optimistic, but I think most of the times once we kind of have a partner identified, we're really hopeful that they'll be able to kind of move forward. And sometimes I find it difficult sometimes for researchers to walk away from something that is not working, especially once they've kind of made the initial match. And I think it's really important to try to gather as much information up front, and really, this was mentioned before, understand the incentives of that potential partner or firm, and really make explicit what both sides hope to get out of that particular relationship, what some of the different steps will be, what the expected results will be, and talk about those things incredibly clearly, not only at high levels. You may have a champion within the organization, that's really important, but most of the burden of experiments ends up falling on the people who are executing day to day, and they don't necessarily get the value of the experiment or the research, but they bear a lot of the burden of needing to implement things in a rigid way that's different from their already difficult job that they're doing. So I think having a lot of conversations up front that go beyond just like, hey, yeah, we're really excited about the potential result, but what are the actual implications of doing this? What are the steps that need to happen? What are the things that go out of the business as usual? What are some of the costs that are involved, the timelines, things like that? And being really clear about that, I think, is important. The other thing that I notice a lot about, whether it's a private firm, it's more in private firms probably than public sector, is that they overestimate how much people want their stuff. And they think that the take up of their program or intervention is like 100%. Like, this is the greatest thing ever. And so you're going to find the best results. Everybody wants our thing. So if we go in and we offer it, like, everyone's going to accept it. And if you go with those assumptions, you're going to be very disappointed when you start offering that maybe outside of their particular population of interest, because you need to go somewhere else and some things change. And they're going to say, we don't want to pilot anything. We know it works because it works, and piloting is costly and it's going to extend our timeline. So please, let's just bang forward with this experiment. And I think it's incredibly important to test a lot of those assumptions. And you have to walk that line carefully, because you don't want to insult the group saying like, no, you think your take up's going to be 70, 80, 90%. It's probably really going to be 30%. But you have to kind of show people that through, like, let's test some things. And this is for our learning. This is for yours. We want this to work. It'll be less costly in the long run if we pilot some of these things. And showing people very clearly where some assumptions hold and where others may fail is usually an important thing. So I think that's super important. I'm generally wary of startups in general. They're usually very excited to jump onto experiments because they want to maybe show the world how exciting their product or program or policy or whatever is. And in the end, they have to be very nimble. They have limited resources. They need to keep moving, and some of those things can crash with running an experiment. And that's not to say it's not possible, but I think you have to be extra careful with startups and choose your design really wisely and make sure there's a lot of buffers built in, because yeah, it can get difficult. And then I think the other thing I'd mention is just kind of a clear theory of change. There are a lot of organizations who like have this program or this policy or something that they're able to communicate maybe in a nice way in some slides. But when you kind of get down to, I just want the theory of change. What is the need? What are the various inputs or activities that are happening? What are the outputs that are expected? What are the outcomes? And what are the assumptions across the board, a lot of organizations really don't have that nailed down in a clean way. And so you have to have that patience to kind of sit down with them and really say, is this theory of change clear? Is it tight? Do we agree on its steps, on its underlying assumptions? I think that's incredibly important. So there's just some thoughts on some things that I usually look for in organizations, private or public or non-for-profit, when kind of moving forward with an experiment.
Catia.
Okay, so well, actually, I think Luigi and Kyle said it all, but maybe let me take some stock and highlight a few things. I mean, not to say it again, but maybe I should. I think, again, teamwork is of the essence here, and your partner is part of the team. So as Luigi and Kyle already said, you have to have a champion that is relevant within the partner organization. Okay, otherwise, I mean, yeah, you will need support from within the organization to be able to implement the intervention in order to be able to evaluate it properly. So this is, of course, I mean, engagement is key. So you were asking about like red flags. So if you don't have an engaged partner, okay, you might as well just stop what you're doing, because I mean, we all know that even with the engaged partners, sometimes experiments fail, okay, and that is bound to happen. But when you have an engaged partner, hopefully you'll be able to learn from the experiment even when it fails. Now, if you don't have an engaged partner, then I mean, yeah, everything is bound to fail and you won't learn from it. And that's the worst, because we all know doing experiments that, okay, we often don't get the results we expected, but we can learn from that. We can, I mean, within the context of that experiment or for the following that you are working on, we can learn from failed experiments that happen often, but this requires that engaged partner. So, I mean, it is crucial that you have it. And then the other thing that Kyle was also mentioning is that your partner that has to be committed has also to understand that we are testing, that we are evaluating, that there is a good chance that things don't work. And actually, so in my experience, I find that the best partners are those that approach us already with some idea that they want to test something. When someone wants to be tested, those are actually the best partners. And oftentimes those are the experiments that actually work, because they already know enough to know that, well, I don't have a perfect chance of succeeding in this intervention, and I want you guys to think together with me or with us. Usually it's another team. It's not just the team of researchers doing the experiment. It's another team of people in your partner organization that want to go together with your team and learning from the different, I mean, from this diversity. So again, okay, I'm always saying the same thing, which is, this is again, teamwork. Everyone has to be engaged and aligned in the objectives of what you're doing. So I don't think I can't add any more to what Kyle and Luigi were already saying.
Great, thanks, Catia. I don't know, Luigi, if you had any other thoughts on that, or like early signals or anything on top of what you already said in the first response. But
I think the more about early signals maybe is sort of practical tips how to set it up, and I speak mostly from sort of the things I wish I did more when I started. I think when you start a partnership, there are some sort of few key elements, few key things that you can do to maximize the chances of figuring out whether a partnership is going to work. One is write down every single question that you want to be answered at the end of the first 1, 2, 3 chats. I cannot tell you how many times when I started, chatting with firms, I would, have calls, be very excited, then, go back to John and John asking me questions like, oh, what did they say about that? And I was like, oh, I didn't ask that. I don't know. So really write down everything and get a sparring partner, like, someone, make up a pretend organization and then have someone ask you questions about that organization. Everything that you don't have an answer to, that's something that should be written down. Of course, you have to be smart. It has to be, you don't want it to sound like an interview where, a quiz, but sort of try to organically embed in your initial conversations questions that you have. Write them down, write the answers down. I cannot tell you how many times like a firm or organization said something and then 5 minutes later I forget. So write it down. It's perfectly fine to say, ask politely if you can take notes. Most people don't complain. 2, be clear early on about what are the outcome variables that they want to move up. Like I cannot, I mean, I have so many recollections of endless conversations where, you know, it wasn't clear exactly if there was one or two outcomes that the company wants to move, what would those outcomes be? And this might be tricky, but, you know, it really boils down to whether a partnership is doable or not. You know, a company wants to increase customer satisfaction, great, but what does it mean in practice? And why do we care about as economists? Does it mean more customers? Does it mean, you know, more cost savings for the company? These are things that are really hard to nail down, but are really important. Three, I think it's important to be structured and to keep the momentum going. So one way to find out whether a partnership is going to work is to be the captain of the plan. So make interim goals, like set up calls like once every week or every 2 weeks, and you set the agenda. Like you say, okay, so in the next 2 weeks or 1 week, let's try to figure out X, Y, Z. And you're the one who steers that X, Y, Z. And that puts you in charge because now from 1 week to another, one meeting to another, you can see to what extent your partner has made progress on that. And that's a good indication to what extent the partner is engaged. I think it's a really bad strategy to just say, oh, let's chat again when we have an answer for X, Y, Z, because it could be 1 day or it could be 2 months, and in between a lot of things can change. And then last, I think, and that is subtle, but I think it's important is, especially when you work with large organizations, is really understand about the politics. The fact that you are proposing an intervention that fits the criteria mentioned, like it is an intersection between business need and academic needs. So it's perfectly in that intersection. Sounds great. What is the problem? Maybe it's an objective that your partner, your champion really likes and someone in another division hates because it goes into the way of what they're doing. So try to understand who may block your project and for what reasons. And again, we said it many times, cannot stress it enough, have a team. Don't be an island. Get people that are competent in different things and involve as many, shop around your ideas. Exactly the same way where you shop around ideas for papers, do the same with, you know, call up colleagues and say, hey, I spoke with this company, you know, they do X, Y, Z. I thought about that. What do you think?
Perfect. Thanks so much for those responses. And I guess you guys have brought up a little bit about like identifying some potential issues. And I think one thing that I try to do and that a lot of people recommend is to try to do a small experiment. I mean, you can call it a pilot, or you might be addressing one of their other questions that they have in mind to try to identify if they are able to get you the data. And Luigi, you brought this up, and I find this a lot in Latin America, is the legal issue. So it's not just a European issue. I think in a lot of places in Latin America, there's really strong legal restrictions on what you can do. And the process of going through this can take a really long time. And it's just a back and forth. And so I just wanted to get your perspectives on whether you think it's a good idea to just get started with a project and go through with what you have in mind and try to convince people to do that, or to do a small experiment to get them to buy into the process or to test their capacity to actually conduct the experiments and produce the necessary data. Also because, you know, there's a risk. If the first one fails, you know, you might be putting the sort of future experiment at risk as well. And it might fail because you did something wrong. So I just wanted to get you guys' opinions on that and whether you think it's a good idea. I'll start with Kyle.
I absolutely think it's fundamental to pilot. It doesn't necessarily need to be the design in a mini version A to Z. You can pilot components of things, but I think it's incredibly important to really pressure test whatever intervention there is, depending on how developed it is, how similar where you're expecting to implement a particular design is to where something has been implemented. But you really have to test a lot of the underlying assumptions of an intervention, and you can find clever ways, lower cost ways to do that. But the intervention needs to be as good as possible. Otherwise, you're testing potentially how, like, the delivery of it, not necessarily the impact of the particular intervention or policy or program. So I think spending time finding clever ways to pilot the intervention is important. The other side on measurement is also incredibly important. So whether that's collecting data in the field, through primary surveys or the administrative data, which you brought up, Luigi brought up. I know Catia has worked with a ton of administrative data in trying to work with mobile money firms, et cetera. Too many times measurement can fail both at the primary level because you're measuring something, you're not getting what you thought you were getting, and just a little bit of piloting would have understood that. I mean, we've done so many iterations of piloting of various questionnaires where they have changed drastically from their first version to the version that's been implemented. And then likewise, there have been so many experiments that fail because someone thought the indicator that they were going to get from a firm in administrative data was not what they got. The data wasn't clean, the legality of it failed. And so being able to pilot both the intervention, but also your measurement technique, whether that's in person or administrative data, is incredibly important. And I think that there are very rare cases where the trade-off goes the other direction, where it makes sense to really move forward directly with an experiment. I think there are a few, but for the most part, I would err on the side of really trying to pilot as much of the underlying assumptions of your design as possible prior to rolling it out.
Yes, Catia, if you want to, feel free to jump in.
Okay. Okay, so let me say two things. One, just, I mean, Jared, you were briefly mentioning about like the complications of getting, legal agreements, confidentiality, all of this stuff in Europe, in Latin America, but that also applies to Africa. Let me just say that especially in this mobile money work, it took us more than 1 year to have lawyers agree with our confidentiality agreement, admin data usage. So yeah, it applies, I guess, all over the world. So that was just a side comment. Now, on this, start small, I cannot agree more. Although I look at this question a bit in a different perspective. So I totally agree with what Kyle said. Piloting, doing qualitative work, this all is of the essence to have a properly designed field experiment, okay, so from which we can learn. But when you asked this question, what I was thinking about was really doing other sorts of work that are self-contained in a way from which we can learn, together with a partner and in itself before launching, say, a larger scale field experiment. So I've done this a lot. One example that I think is the one most striking in my experience is this on irregular migration in the Gambia. So there we started by doing a lab in the field. Okay, so our big question was, why is it that we see these many irregular migrants leaving the country and West Africa in general to Europe? And they are about to go in a journey that is very deadly. Okay, so we knew that about 1/3 of people that embark in this journey die in Dubai. So what we started by doing was, at a relatively small scale, a few hundreds of people, we tried to really measure how they reacted to, we had some incentives, but how they reacted to different scenarios of information about both the risk of dying and the risk of getting a legal permit upon arrival to Europe. Okay, and so in the process of these lab in the field, what we learned was actually their priors. And what happened there is that if we were to tell them the true risk, as well as we can measure it, of dying in Dubai, we would actually be incentivizing this sort of migration. Okay, and this we learned because we did this lab in the field before doing the large field experiment. Then we went on to do the large field experiment, but when we did it, all our interventions were carefully calibrated with this in mind. We knew the beliefs to start with, okay? We knew that if we were to tell them that the risk of dying would be 1/3, we would incentivize migration because these potential migrants thought the risk was 50%, 1 out of 2 would die. Okay, and so this is what experiments are about. We keep learning from these things that we do not know before we go into the field and we partner. And so, and we work with people. And so I think this is really key. Okay, and in the process, of course, from your question, we had a partner, NGO, okay, and that they were working with us on these kind of informational campaigns, and our relationship with them was only strengthened by this initial work. So again, I think this is a win-win. I really do not see how this can go wrong, in the sense that if it doesn't work, if the relationship breaks down at small scale, I mean, it wouldn't work anyways when you scale it up. So I mean, I really am very much in favor of not only pilots and qualitative work, but actually run some smaller experiments to learn before you go into full scale.
Yeah, I think I want to offer a slightly different perspective. I mean, of course, piloting is fundamental, and that goes without saying. You should never run an experiment before piloting. I think especially when it comes to experiments run with organizations, a pilot may be a little bit too late, in the sense that to run a pilot, it means that you already have in place a lot of things that you may not have, like legal agreements, data usage agreements, access to data, and this stuff. So piloting is definitely fundamental, but there's something you can do a little early on. It's something that with the Institute for Behavioral Economics, John and I are really trying to, think hard how to sort of offer that, is to think in terms of gift exchange. So when you enter in a partnership, firms usually sit on a pile of data. So a good way to establish goodwill is to just offer to have a look at that data. Of course, I should give credit to John of the idea, of course, but this has two advantages. One is it creates a sort of gift exchange. Like, now, me as a researcher, I'm doing something for you, organization, for free, out of goodwill, without any understanding, any expectation that that would necessarily spur an experiment. So this puts you in the position of doing something useful for the company, which creates trust, and that's positive. But two, it also puts you in control of two things. One, you're now in charge of steering the conversation of what design you should do. So you're the one analyzing the data. So you're the one presenting cool graphs saying, hey, look, there's something interesting there. Of course, this is not causal. Let's run an experiment. So if you're the one analyzing data, you're in control of the narrative of things that you want to investigate. That, of course, doesn't mean deceiving the company, of course, but it means sort of taking, as an economist, charge of the research question that you think are important, both for you and for the business. Two, I think the side advantage of that is that that goes back to my previous point, understanding the data environment. This gives you an immediate, really good sense of what the data environment looks like. If they can't give you the data because of legal constraints, or the data is there but it's messy and stuff, this is something you will find immediately, because the moment you offer to do something with the existing data, it turns out that it's really hard to get. Well, that's a pretty big red flag of what's coming ahead. So yeah, sum up, offering to do some data analysis of what exists already, I think has a lot of benefits. Of course, as it doesn't bring you any experiments, but it's a good way to start. And I think the last thing I want to add is, because it's something that I thought, I changed my mind a little bit on this subject. And I think that's what you meant, Jared, with the idea of like, why don't we start with running an experiment that is not academically relevant, but gets the firm excited. Over the years, I changed a little bit my perspective on that. I thought that was a really good idea. But then it turns out that the effort that you have to put into that is equivalent to the effort you would put on academically relevant paper. And it faces exactly the same burdens. So, and the risk is that, you do it, and then the firm is like, okay, we're done. So I'm now I lean more towards sort of this approach of analyzing existing data and going for the big experiment, rather than, experiments that have no academic value.
Great. Yeah, no, I think also, I mean, this might not be the best idea, but if you have all the existing data as well, I think it's also good to think about, I mean, potentially your experiment will fail, right? I mean, there's a risk there. And sometimes actually with the administrative data, you can think about papers to write, interesting papers to write. Even if the experiment fails, you might have something interesting there. So, I mean, that's not always the case if you're working on certain things, and, with migration in Africa, that might be a little bit difficult. There won't be that data environment sometimes, but That's definitely a good point, Luigi, as well, to look at the existing data. So actually, I wanted to, you mentioned a couple of things about sort of goodwill, and that made me think about sort of many times we're thinking about the firm itself and how to get the most out of the firm, but then we don't think as much about how to be good partners for the firm. And then sometimes actually they're asking a lot of us, right? So they'll come back and they want things all the time, right? And it's like, oh, I want this report, I want this report, I want this report. And so I was wondering if you guys had experience with sort of what you think is the best way to be a good partner for the firm, and then sort of how to say no and like how to set your boundaries when it comes to them demanding things from you as well.
May I go first? So revert a little bit the order. So I think I want to do like a 30-second elevator pitch for the Institute for Behavioral Economics that is just started and now an empty shell, but the plan is to grow. So here, I think 4 key points that we think this institute has to offer both to scholars and firms, and especially firms. One is streamline the exploration phase. When we complain about wasting time for 4 months or a year in discussing with a company, we rarely realize that we're wasting their time as well. So really, being able to streamline how you get to a good understanding of what is the potential for a partnership, it's good not only for you, but it's also extremely useful for the company. 2, I think we can do better and that's one of the goals of the Institute, is support the managerial and legal side of the partnerships. Not everyone knows how to handle and navigate those complex partnerships. We can do better and be prepared. One way, scholars can be prepared is just talk to their legal offices and sort of figure out if, there are data usage agreements in place. And that's one of the services that we hope to provide in the near future with the Institute. I think 3 is we can do a better job in smart matching. What I mean with that is, we tend to do a bad job finding the right co-authors, like in the sense that, as I mentioned before, field experiments sometimes require very complementary skills. And so matching is really important. And sometimes we waste too much time before finding the right partner that really knows that data environment, for instance. And I think 4th, firms invest a tremendous amount of time doing an experiment with us. And then when the experiment is over, you as a researcher, you leave, but you have created a capital there, a trust capital and institutional infrastructure capital within the company that some other researchers could use. And so, putting that into action, so retaining and nurture those relationships and perhaps give it to other researchers that have other research questions. These are all things that I think we as economists, we can do to sort of give more bang for the buck to firms. Last but not least, we're really good at writing papers. We are really bad at writing white papers and materials that the firm can actually use with their stakeholders or their companies. And that is a part that I think we can do better on that. Using the results we have to create clear, actionable messages that can be used for civil society or diffusion in newspapers and stuff. That part we can definitely do better.
Great. Catia, I don't know if you had any perspective on this as well.
So let me again mention a bit what we said before. So partnership is about being a team and a diverse team. So what we have to gain from this partnership, what our partner has to gain from this work is really those skills that we have, they don't have, and that are somehow complementary, right? So ideally, as we said before, is that you have this partner that approaches you because the organization wants to be evaluated. There is some idea that they have a sense, okay, it's a good chance of working, but they're not very sure how it will happen, and they want to think together with us about it. And I think, that's the key on where to start, okay? And that's what we have to offer, is our ability to think about mechanisms, about how these interventions might or not succeed and why, so as to help them measure the impact and scale it where it works, okay? Now, the other question you were implicitly asking is, what to do if the partner does not seem engaged. And what I would say is just don't do it. because if you don't have an engaged enough partner, I mean, you'll be wasting your time. There are so many potential interventions that can make a difference that it is a waste of resources. And here it's not only about money, it's about time. It's about the people that work in these experiments that are so valuable. Maybe this is the most the scarcest of resources. So that, I mean, you really, when there isn't an engaged partner, someone that talks the same language, that understands that we can mutually benefit from this partnership, I would say don't do it and look for something that has more potential for both parties. So in short, I'm repeating a bit what I said before.
Thanks, Catia.
Cool. I don't know if I have tons to add. I think a lot of these points were excellent. One issue on relationships that can often be some tension between kind of the research side and whether it's a policymaker or even a firm is kind of the desire to have results quickly, which is not necessarily always the incentive for a researcher who wants to be very careful and methodical and rigorous in producing results. But being able to find something Luigi mentioned, like some of these gifts early on that you can provide to firms, whether that's even in analyzing administrative data, some of the descriptive aspects of maybe survey data, some of those kind of early insights, and they may even be more operational, can be very valuable to a firm, even if those don't make it into an academic paper. And being able to provide those and actually give effort and be timely about providing those, I think is important to think through. And a part of that is also kind of like some of the skills transfer in a sense. This depends on who the organization is, but oftentimes with experiments, it can be really valuable to collect some good monitoring data, set up a good solid monitoring system throughout the course of an intervention. You're trying to understand how it's being implemented, to what level of compliance, et cetera. And some of those even basic monitoring systems can be very valuable for that firm or for that organization to be able to embed and incorporate into their systems, and being able to work with them to find ways that those work not only during the experiment, but can be aspects that they can take into their work beyond maybe the particular relationship, can be a really nice transfer. I thought the point about being effective at communicating results in ways that are useful not only for that firm and their organization, their decision making, but also in the way that they then communicate that to their stakeholders is something that as researchers and groups working at that intersection of policy and research, I think we can continue to get better at. And also thinking through kind of like, what are the next steps beyond an experiment? For the researcher, it may be a path towards publication. That's kind of what you're focused on, but how an organization or a firm is going to use those results, what's maybe the path to scaling or redesigning a particular intervention and policy. I think having those conversations early and often can be very beneficial to that particular partner and to the partnership and the relationship. So thinking through how the implications of results will lead into decision making and potential scale, I think really helps to foster a good relationship, because they're not going to be super excited, or they're not worried about like what the publication is like a couple of years from now. They're thinking about how to use those results for their day-to-day decision making in the short run.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, those are all good perspectives. And, you know, as you guys all said, we do have a lot to offer, but I think, you know, making sure that we're doing that on a regular basis and finding the best way to do that and communicate our results, particularly to the firm, but then also to the broader community, is an essential service that we provide as economists. So with that, so I have a million more questions I'd love to ask, but I think I will let other people jump in if they have any other questions from the audience. John is here as well. I'm sure he was happy to hear about Kyle's point about scaling as well.
And Catia, thank you both very much. I love the scale word, of course. I do have a quick question. I think that was excellent. And so I have a chapter in my book called Winners Quit. And Catia, I think you brought it up. And I make a psychological argument and an economics argument about how we neglect opportunity cost of time. And that's just something that humans do. And I've been interviewed a lot lately about that chapter. And I'm going to ask you three the question, because I've heard all of you say pivot, quit, call it audible, etc. Because I think you should never say the Q word. You should always say audible or pivot, because then it's cool. Just like when you talk to firms, you should never say the E word. The minute you say experiment, you're done. You have to say pilot or some such, right? Okay. So what a lot of people ask is, how do you know when to quit? Because we don't want to quit too early. You don't want to quit too late. Can you give a set of heuristics or rules that you go through in your mind that you would think for yourself is the optimal quitting rule? Anybody help everyone? Because that's important, right? It's important not only where you cast your line, right? Government, public, private, et cetera, but how long should you wait till reel it in and go in a new lake?
I think that's a really great question. Okay, and well, thank you, John, and thank you also for having us here today. And I think this is particularly difficult in my case, for example, where I work in Africa, where things tend to take a while, where say NGOs or other partners typically don't have a lot of resources. Okay, and so the thing here is waiting times on the one hand, and on the other hand, to fill the engagement. And I think, I mean, for me personally, I mean, I have no clear line whatsoever. I think that would be too hard to make, but I think that's where it is important to be in the field, to create a relationship or not. I mean, you have to really feel the engagement from the other party. Of course, you have to know the context so that you understand that, okay, maybe taking 1 week to answer about those data is normal because they are not so easily accessible, because there are not enough people, they are not that skilled getting to it. But okay, so understanding the context, you will have some idea about the engagement of the partner. I would say that's the key thing I would look at in making this decision, but there is no hard rule whatsoever. I think that would be impossible to make.
Yeah.
Kyle, how do you decide when you quit on a project at IPA?
Oh man, yeah, no, it's incredibly difficult. I think having shared expectations, very clear expectations about the expected results, that those have to be aligned, and then working back from those on what are the timeline and various activities that we're going to have to follow. And usually for me, if we can get past the point of we have really shared kind of expectations in terms of what we hope, and we're clear on kind of how long it will take and what will be needed, is like a good first step. If we can't agree on that, obviously I think it's hard to move forward. And then usually there's the aspect of putting something into action, the intervention of whatever it is, and then there's the measurement component. And so whether that's administrative data, if we're not able to see the administrative data and start to kind of believe that that is going to be able to measure what we hope to measure, so we're not able to at least see 10 lines of sample data, or we're not able to pilot, a survey in the field and see how that's measuring things, that's a point as well where, we have to walk away. Or if on the intervention side, if there's no credible way to see that intervention in action, to be able to observe it, to monitor, to test a few of the underlying assumptions, then that's also the point where it's probably not going to happen kind of going forward. I think one of the trickier things then is determining what's the right way you want to frame the end of that thing. Is it a pivot? Is it kind of, let's kind of see what's next, or let's kind of take some time to continue to work on these things? or is it, we kind of end there? And I think that's a hard bit. But for me, the three components is like, there's got to be really clear shared expectations on the final result and the work that's going to need to take place in terms of timing and cost investments to get there. You have to be able to have some idea or visibility in believing that the data are going to be there, and then on the intervention side that it's going to be able to be implemented as planned. That can take a long time to get there, and so it's hard to determine at what point you may lose interest, but kind of feel that out a little bit as well for how much the leadership of a particular organization is willing to kind of push to those three goals. And same thing on the research side. And so fatigue is something that, when people start to not believe in that final result or in kind of the pieces to get there on either the data or the intervention, then I think it's time to look other places.
Yeah, so we have 2 minutes left before John's talk. The short answer is I don't know. I tend to quit too late systematically, so I'm probably the last person, and that might be inexperience or I think there, back to the environments, like the data environment, the institutional environment, and the incentive environment, there are things that have more uncertainty and things that have less. Like data is one of those things that either is there or is not. And to me, like that's kind of a deal breaker. If it's really hard to get data and it's clear that that's going to be an issue, that's probably a really big red flag. Two, agreement on publication is your impression is that it's something that it's put under the rug and not, you can't have an open conversation about that's the reason for quitting. After that, I think there's an intermediate solution between sort of quitting or pivoting, which is diluting sort of, if there's uncertainty about like processes, maybe you can dilute a little bit the timing. That's probably sort of a soft version of quitting, which is like letting things fade away, keeping a door open. But yeah.
Yeah, so thank you all three of you. Yeah, I think of quitting a little bit like I call the 3 C's, critical thinking, culture, and creativity. It's really hard to define those, but once you see them, you know what they are. The keyword is very similar, that I can't really give you an algorithm, but once I see it, I know it. And it really does come from experience. But I can say, like Luigi, that the general, I guess 2 things. 1, we tend to quit too late, but 2, don't quit unless you have an outside option. So a lot of times you want to quit, and then what are you going to do? Go sit in your office? Right? So I think outside option is super important when it comes to quitting. A lot of times we only wait until our current lot in life is soiled, and then we look to quit. We should be quitting just as often when our opportunity set changes, right? Because that's what we should always be comparing. And we don't do that. It's kind of interesting as humans because we think so narrowly. But as an organizer, Jared, I'm going to throw it back to you. I want to thank the panel for doing this. These are thankless jobs, but they're important. I think that was just an excellent discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I'd just like to say thanks again to everybody for coming. I think it was a great discussion. And I think Catia's point at the very beginning about sort of thinking about how as young scholars, we can manage all of these relationships, the opportunity cost of time and how we're able to do that and have families and sort of move forward in our lives as well is something that we should talk about more. So with that, Carolina has been nice enough to put the link for John's keynote in the chat. So people feel free to follow that now, and we'll move over to that. And thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.